This is a short webinar introducing you to the article published in Acta, Neuropsychiatrica, Empirical Tests of Natural Selection-Based Evolutionary Accounts of ADHD, a Systematic Review. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is a childhood-onset neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, causing significant burden on those affected, their families, and society as a whole. ADHD is highly impairing, highly heritable, and yet highly prevalent, with a present prevalence of about 5% among children and adolescents. This presents a challenge to natural selection-based accounts of human evolution. If a mental disorder such as ADHD is so disabling and impairing, one would expect it to reduce the reproductive fitness of the individual affected by it, so that the genetic variants responsible are selected out. It's been suggested that while ADHD may be maladaptive in the present environment, it's contributed to increased fitness in an ancestral environment, allowing individuals to survive and pass on their genes. Several evolutionary hypotheses have been proposed in an attempt to resolve this apparent paradox. Examples of these are the hunter-farmer theory by Tom Hartman, considering individuals with ADHD traits as hunters, and in contrast, individuals without ADHD traits have the virtues of farmers. A waiter and a fighter theory by Shelley Tremblay and Rosen proposed other possible interpretations of the paradox. And a response readiness theory proposed by Jensen et al. Claimed that ADHD traits may be beneficial in environments characterized by rapid changes, external threats, and scarce food resources. This is further illustrated in a figure on the next slide. Here you see the three defining traits of ADHD: inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. According to the response readiness hypothesis, the ancestral environment was unsafe and depleted, while our modern environment, on the opposite, is safe and rich. In an unsafe and depleted ancestral environment, inattention could have been vigilance and the ability to scan the surroundings for possible dangers. Impulsivity could have been the ability of a hunter to attack or flee. And hyperactivity, an exploratory behavior which is useful for identifying new food sources in the surrounding area or for migrating towards better habitats. These abilities would all have been adaptive and increased the selection of individuals carrying the ADHD traits. In our modern environment, it's an advantage to have focused attention, be able to analyze, and plan to sit still in the school or at your job. These traits do not fit the defining traits of ADHD, why they are predominantly maladaptive in modern, safe and resource-rich environments. Hence the definition of ADHD as a mental disorder. These evolutionary hypotheses seem somewhat speculative and certainly remain nothing but hypotheses until supported by empirical evidence. In order to investigate to which extent the natural selection-based accounts of ADHD have been investigated in empirical studies, we have conducted a systematic review of the literature on empirical investigations of natural selection-based evolutionary accounts of ADHD following the PRISMA guidelines. The PubMed, Embase, and PsycInfo databases were screened for relevant publications by combining search terms covering evolution and selection with search terms covering ADHD. 892 records were identified through database searches. 102 duplicates were removed, leading to 790 screened records. 775 of these were excluded, and 15 full-text articles were assessed for eligibility, leading to inclusion of 3 articles in the review. So, out of 790 records screened, only 3 studies were included in our review. The studies by Ding et al. And Wang et al. Are genetic and report on the evolution of the 7-repeat allele of the ADHD-associated dopamine receptor D4 gene. The study by Williams and Taylor report on the results of a simulation study of the effect of suggested ADHD traits on group survival. The authors of the 3 studies all interpret their findings as favoring the notion that ADHD traits may have been associated with increased fitness during human evolution. We argue that none of the 3 included studies really tap into the core symptoms of ADHD, and that their conclusions therefore lack validity for the disorder. However, if we give the assumptions of the studies the benefit of the doubt, it's notable that their results are all compatible with the response readiness hypothesis proposed by Jensen et al. And shown in the figure earlier. Some may argue that studying the natural selection-based aspects of ADHD is a mere academic exercise. However, as pointed out by Jensen et al., understanding ADHD symptoms within the context of their adaptive functions is a promising alternative strategy for discovering and understanding gene environment and brain behavior interactions. Furthermore, viewing ADHD from the natural selection perspective could potentially inform the design of new behavioral interventions that may improve the educational and vocational outcome of children with ADHD. This review indicates that the natural selection-based accounts of ADHD have not been subjected to empirical tests and therefore remain hypothetical. The authors of the 3 studies included in the review interpret their findings as favoring the notion that ADHD traits may have been associated with increased fitness during human evolution. However, we argue that none of the 3 studies really tap into the core symptoms of ADHD, and that their conclusions therefore lack validity for the disorder. This review indicates that the natural selection-based accounts of ADHD have not been subjected to empirical tests and therefore remain hypothetical. We suggest that this gap in knowledge should be addressed in future studies. Thank you for listening.